Barbados are leading the calls from various Caribbean nations for the UK to pay billions in slave trade reparations. It's just extraordinary. There's a study has suggested that 200 billion should just about cover Britain's contribution to reparations to all the Caribbean nations which have suffered. We've had David Lamb, the Foreign Secretary, whose parents were from Guyana, which, although, counted, as a Caribbean nation, of course, it's South America, sort of Caribbean nation, and has very much spoken about this as well. Given that the Prime Minister happily gave away the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, who had no claim on them whatsoever legitimately, they never ruled, they're back 1,500 miles away from them, and a strategic military base for us in the United States only a couple of weeks ago. I've not got much hope that Keir Starmer isn't going to do this. There's a real concern about Labour politicians that everyone's paying lip service to sort of, Britain's past is so terrible and we're all so guilty of all these awful things, and the Caribbean islands basically pretending all of the things that are wrong with our countries are all down to slave trade that ended almost 200 years ago.
Man, this, I'll just hand it over to Sada.
I just think you can hear the colonial mentality in even how she's speaking. So even when they try to distance themselves from really like slavery and all of these things, you can hear from how she's speaking about owning, Chagos Island. And she's very okay with that. It's a strategic military base for us. And she's trying to speak as if she was there in slavery time, she wouldn't do that. She's more moral, but you can still see that colonial mentality in how she speaks of,
Mr. Ken, what are your thoughts?
She also displays real ignorance of history. The slave trade was really traumatic for millions of Africans who were taken to the Caribbean and other places, and the effects can be felt up to date.
I think we've covered Hartley on previous reactions, and I think she's been consistent in her utter disregard for people who she doesn't really regard as, maybe being her skin color. We've seen how she's dehumanized Palestinians, how she's made excuses for Israel killing children, killing women, killing Palestinian men. So I think this is par for the course for her. And I'm not sure whether you mentioned it before, but I think it's also a consequence of Britain not really being forced to bear the consequences of its mistakes. Because for one, you have Julia here, who doesn't even want to acknowledge that Britain benefited from slavery, or that the people that they enslaved could still be going through this issue still today. There's an article you shared from, I think, CARICOM, where basically it was a 10-point reparations guideline framework, which I think it could be what she's alluding to. And it's clear, we're looking at one place where there used to be like 3 million people and now there are 30,000. If you look at Haiti, for example, where the life expectancy I think was like 5 years, where your work was basically taken from Africa, get to Haiti, worked to death, get another fresh batch. Like this had an impact on African societies. There are communities that were broken up. The trust, the maybe trade relations, it was all skewed. And, I think if you also look at Haiti, for example, where, she doesn't want to pay reparations because, it doesn't concern her. But remember, Haiti paid a reverse form of reparations, which I think if you factor in inflation, it's like $21 billion now. Haiti, this country that was fresh out of slavery, had nothing, was forced to use a huge part of its annual, income to service. Basically for the crime of freeing themselves from slavery, they had to pay France all this money. And let's not forget that since we are on Britain's case right now, there are families that as late as 2015, slave-owning families, right, still were receiving reparations from the British government. So it's like, how is, what happened in the past not related to what's happening today? Unless, of course, it fits your narrative to not admit that.
And just as an example of Barbados, which she mentioned, in 1661, the colonial administration in Barbados passed the slave code, which in essence said that African slaves were as good as commodities. Like they were not even human.
Right.
Like you could get, as William mentions, a fresh batch of commodities from Africa, work them to death, get another batch, and so on and so forth. And it had a real effect on how Africans were viewed across the whole Western Hemisphere. Like these were not even human. They were like mules, donkeys, meant for work.
Yeah, sacco.
Yeah.
And even after slavery was abolished, as she claims, was ended by the British, even after emancipation, policies were put in place to make sure that Africans did not attain the same level of life.
100%.
Yes.
And
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say what's interesting is whenever they have these conversations about reparations, nobody ever brings up the fact that slave owners were actually compensated. Like
but not
Britain
the
paid
slaves.
out like 20 million to slave owners, but then the actual oppressed people didn't get, like, have not gotten anything. There's no form of reparations. There's no form of justice. You know,
Exactly.
so it's very interesting that people don't mention that. Like, I don't hear her questioning why the slave owners were, you know, compensated.
And it's interesting you mentioned the compensation to the slave owners, because there's also the direct links to capitalism and slavery and colonization. For example, a lot of the slave owners and the guys shipping Africans across the Atlantic Ocean, they would get insurance payouts in case of loss of cargo.
Right.
Because it was essentially cargo to them. And these companies are based in the New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange.
Yeah, Barclays was involved.
JP Morgan Chase.
Yeah.
They were the ones underwriting the trade.
For sure.
And they even, I think, apologized at some point. So you can see there's a direct link from slavery to modern capitalism.
Yeah, today.
Yeah, and I think...
And that extraction of wealth from Africans and Africa, and the current disparities in wealth.
Yeah.
Like you cannot separate those issues.
Yeah, you can't.
I think just maybe hammering Ken's point, Britain today is a member of the G8, it's a member of the G20, and this is largely due to the head start it had during the Industrial Revolution. And let's not forget, these a huge part of the resources they had to kickstart the Industrial Revolution came from slavery. So how do you see Britain being this economic power in the world it is today? And of course realize that it's Industrial Revolution that really kickstarted that. And again, fail to factor in the fact that it was the sale of human beings to plantations in the Caribbean and elsewhere that gave Britain this predominant position. And something else I forgot was about the Chagos Islands. She says, she's really upset that the Labour government gave the Chagos Islands back to
like that.
back to Mauritius. And she's like, the Chagos Islands is like what, 1,600 miles from Mauritius? I'm like, okay, fine. Then how far away is Britain from the Chagos Islands, if that's your argument? So I think you're dealing with a very, very dishonest person, as history has shown us. Anything else?
Yeah. I want to say something I just forgot, actually. I forgot. I'll come back to it later.
I wanted to mention the name Wall Street. Wall Street is named after a wall that was built by blacks. In fact, I think about 160 feet away.
I didn't know that.
Like there was a slave market just like maybe a few 100,000 feet away from where the current Wall Street is situated.
For sure.
It really shows you the symbolism.
And other cities also, London, Liverpool, Bristol. These were port cities that were really involved in the slave trade, and what really gave them the prominence again is all back to the slave trade. So how are you as a British person unaware of all of this unless you're willfully ignorant?
Yeah, I think there's just a dehumanization of certain people just generally, and it also really creeps into people's mentalities and how they view people. So if you're speaking of again, you remember the video we reacted to about when people are speaking about European migrants or European who have, something's happened like in Ukraine, or they humanize them so much, and even when they speak of history, things that happen to European people or white people are spoken of in a very human, in a very I can relate to where there's emotion, there's not this very blatant, just nonchalant expression of it. It's, you know, even the tone changes. But then when it comes to African people or Palestinian people, there's all this dehumanization, brown people and black people.
I'm really curious whether Julia Hartley, or what her position is on reparations to victims of the Holocaust. Because they did get their reparations for like decades, right? So I'm pretty sure, since, you know, I haven't seen the same level of backlash against the reparations victims of the Holocaust received, as much as we've seen the kind of backlash that, you know, the African people wanting reparations for themselves has gotten.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Holocaust, because Germany pays out compensation.
It still does.
It still does. People who were in concentration camps, the survivors, the children, I think they get a pension up to date. And the payments are done through the German Finance Ministry and other organizations between government to government, Germany, Israel, and other civil rights groups between those two countries. And there's actually a precedent that reparations can be paid.
Because I mean, if the Israelis are getting it, what possible reason is there for Africans not to get theirs?
Can be paid. I just wanted to mention also the amount of reparations that she talked about, 200 billion pounds.
Like,
I think that's just a drop in the ocean, really.
Compared to what they did.
And there's studies that have been done by economists to show that, for example, the Human Development Index, when you look at that index, countries that were colonized, like in the Caribbean and Africa, they rank very low on the scale. And economists have said that the index should factor in history as well.
For sure,
We have India as a very good example, and William has talked about this at other times. India had about 32% share of global GDP before 1700. Well, up to when the British went there. And after colonization, I think it plummeted down to like 4%.
I mean, they even have an actual figure. They say Britain owes them $45 trillion.
USD.
The entire US debt is 30-something trillion. So imagine how much Britain, this small backward island in Europe, how much this small island has extracted from the rest. This is just India with $45 trillion. How about the Caribbean? How about Africa? How about, you know, how about the US itself?
And the same studies show, for example, Africa, I think, had about maybe 8 to 9% share of global GDP before colonization. And currently, maybe we're talking of maybe less than 5%. You can tell that had we not been colonized, had the British not come and taken our best, we would be at a very high human index.
And I think that's something they you know, willfully forget, or when they do like address it, they like paint it as what it's not. For example, colonization, they'll be like, you know, if it wasn't for us, you guys won't have hospitals, you guys won't have schools. And look, I mean, Africa already had these indigenous forms of education, of healthcare, society, medicine, everything. And of course, it wasn't, you know, like the modern devices we had today, but nobody disrupted the Europeans from their development. It was an organic process. You know, we'll start from here, we'll develop slowly. So the argument that they had, I feel it's just, they disrupted African development. Whatever we have today is not out of, you know, their goodness of their heart or anything. They disrupted African technology. I do believe it will be really, really far, because yes, you could say, for example, we gave you guys roads, but you also gave us capitalism. Now, for example, in Kenya today, around 40% of the country lives in poverty, while 8,000 people control 75% of the country's wealth. I think that would have been frankly impossible had colonialism and slavery not happened.
I remember when they came over to like Kenya, where we are at this point in time, they took like 20% of our most fertile land and named it the White Highlands.
Which they control today.
About 7 million acres.
Which they control today. I mean, the Finlay.
It was open to any British settlers coming in. Just you could come in and just get like 100,000 acres and do whatever you want with it. And like you say, those kind of policies exist up to now, where indigenous people are pushed away from their land, generation after generation.
And I think that's the thing, is that like the perpetual, like it's generational, like you're saying, yeah. So like if a generation is poor, the likelihood of that generation coming out on top is very low, right? Yeah. And what usually happens is the exceptions are always presented as the rule, right? So they say, hey, black people, why are you guys complaining? Africans, why are you complaining? Look at Oprah, she made it. Why can't you make it? Yeah, look at Dangote, he's making it. So they always present the exception as the rule, as if the playing field is very even. So it's just you who's not, doing something. And it's
the
like in the hood, just because one person gets out of the hood doesn't mean all 100 have that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at JayZ, for example, the argument has been made that, his success is largely attributed to how well he exploits his fellow black people, going as far as trying to sell his block, Bitcoin, back when I think he was really into it. So I think just maybe even leading into neocolonialism and just showing this is not something that just happened historically and ended. Africa still remains on the lower ranks of the neoliberal capitalist order. And if you look at, for example, West Africa, you have 14 countries who still have their money printed by France.
Keep it in Paris.
Yeah, keeping the reserves,
a thought experiment is, okay, imagine if the French currency was actually being printed in Senegal. I mean, it doesn't immediately align with your thoughts.
Yeah.
And this is, okay, for the French, they simply print the money, take useless paper, print it, and in exchange, they actually buy real, tangible things in gold. Africa. Uranium. They go to Niger, they buy uranium, they buy the oil, they buy the gold. And remember, it didn't cost them anything to make this money. They simply wrote somewhere an IOU, and suddenly they have African resources for absolutely free. Anything else before we continue?
I think at the end, the justice is also about repair, right?
Yes.
You can't just say, that's it, it's
I'm
done.
sorry.
Yeah, it's also about repair. But then one thing I've also come to understand is, I used to not really understand it when people say white people are fearful that if black people were in a place of power, they would do the same thing. And so I never fully understood that, just never connected in my head. But the more I think about it, it's not that they're actually like her, it's not that she's actually ignorant of the impact of slavery. It's more of being fearful of even repairing because of that fear that you have that, there's just preservation basically. You try and preserve yourself because you know how bad it was and you're just not sure what these people will do if they got to a certain position.
Our countries are all down to slave trade that ended almost 200 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's the real crux of this, is that nobody alive today has been part of that.
Yep.
We all admit that that part of history is bad. We are not the only ones who were involved in this at all, and it is wrong, and I think that we've all apologised for that.
I'm not apologising for anything that I wasn't involved in.
It's just one of those things we can see from history that didn't work.
When are the Italians going to apologise to us? When are the Vikings going to apologise to us?
I was going to say, should we go and...
I want my reparations.
Should we go and invade the Faroe Islands?
Yeah, I mean...
Because Denmark came and overtook those as part of their invasion. I mean, where does it stop?
It's just historical grievance grifting.
And how far back do you go? How far back do you have to make reparations? Who are we paying exactly?
Exactly. But the thing, I'm also, again, I'm not sure that I'm thinking my family would have been, on my mum's side, would have been working in some very, very nasty factories, the Victorian mills, 6 days a week, On my dad's side, I'm Irish, I'm going to go with, from Kerry, I'm going to go with peasant farmers. I'm not sure they were living the life of Riley. No. They weren't slaves, not as bad as being a slave, of course not. No one's saying that. It was awful. It was an absolute crime against humanity, but a crime that was carried out by every single empire that has ever existed, and only one empire has stopped slavery. Oh, that was us.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Get to you, Ken.
Should say thank you.
Yeah.
It's like be grateful, you ungrateful people.
It's amazing how she was very quick to say no apologies for that really dark history. And I think there's also legal implications when formal apologies are made, because now that binds the perpetrator to pay restitutions, to make restitutions. And we're at an age and time where international law enshrines human rights universally, and if you're to move on as a species, then international law has to be upheld, and
Right.
apologies for slavery, colonization, and restitution for those crimes has to be made. It's part of what civilization should be, and apologies have to be made, really,
Yeah.
and the follow-up done.
I think there's also like a cultural difference or distinction, which is like, I think of like, for example, South Sudan, part of like sort of the general culture is if I do something wrong to you, my family, whoever it is, will come to apologize, right? So it won't just be me who's held accountable. It's also the communal accountability thing, which I think misses a lot in the Western society. So it's very detached. It's very hyper-capitalism, hyper-individualism. So it's really just about me.
Yeah.
It's not about the community and looking at the next person and, you know.
Yeah.
They can't hide behind the fact that they are not the actual perpetrators. Like it was our great
Yeah, but you're benefiting off it, you know. So
Yeah, I think that was my immediate thought when she said, you know, I'm not going to apologize for something that I wasn't involved in. I'm like, sure, but you live in Britain. The social services that Britain is able to offer you, the NHS, which is crumbling, but, you know, before was a bit more stable. All of these benefits that white people, Europeans, Americans enjoy is a result of taking from someone else. And this refusal to admit that, you know, you messed up, or even if you didn't mess up, that you're benefiting from the pilferage that was conducted by your ancestors, refusing to acknowledge that, I think it's pretty dark. And then when the other guest says, you know, who do we pay to? We've mentioned it, but again, question is, why don't they ever ask that about Israelis? You know, who are we going to pay to?
Who's getting it?
Exactly. The monarchy still exists, and some monarchs were involved in the slave trade. So, yeah.
I mean, they literally prosecute 90, 80-year-old Nazis. So what's stopping them from actually, you know, really getting justice for people? And then there's something else that she says, that everyone did it, you know, so why are we special? Why should we be made to pay back the Africans? Let's go to Italy and tell them to pay us back and all that. I think, one, it's wrong. Because, for example, if you look at, say, Africa and its relations with the rest of the world, I think the very first time that we saw a mass dehumanization of Africans was with the advent of white people. China used to be here. I mean, can you imagine ships trading all the way from China to Africa? They didn't leave with slaves. They merely came, conducted trade, went back. They didn't enslave Africans. They didn't colonize Africa. So her saying that, you know, everyone does it, I think it's a betrayal also of the like Western psyche. Say, for example, I think it also feeds into, for example, what they fear about China, in that for us to grow, we had to do all this bad shit. We had to kill, we had to genocide, we had to steal. So they think for anyone to like rise, this is the necessary
that is the
condition. Yeah, but I feel history has shown us, I mean, China in the last 40 years, can you tell me one country that China has bombed? But in that 40 years, they've gone from a small backwater country into a world superpower. So I think this is something that the Western mind somehow has trouble comprehending, that, you know, this dehumanization of people, this treating of the others, you know, differently. This is not this is not the average human condition. This is not normal. What you're doing is not normal, right? Yeah.
Sure. Very good point.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think enough said.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Oh, okay. For African Stream, I've been William Sakawa.
I'm Sanara Man.
Kanoi Kaigwa.
Peace.